I want to welcome everybody to this mini course in Latin American Jewish theology. I am Magda Tedder. I'm the Schwidler Chair in Judaic Studies at Fordham University and a co-director of Fordham Center for Jewish Studies. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to today's the three sessions of the events. We started the mini courses during the pandemic when we were all trapped at home and had very little to do. We're in a different moment here, so I appreciate you being here and wanting to learn during our winter break. The mini course, this mini course, three-part mini course, will meet on Tuesdays. This Tuesday, a week from now, and on the 13th. And it will be taught by Ilan Stavans, who is the Louis Sebring Professor of Humanities, Latin American and Latino Culture in Amherst College. He is a prolific writer and author and editor of dozens of books. Including very recent one, if you are interested in festive and like cooking, on Mexican Jewish cuisine. So I highly recommend that. He's also our Fordham NYPL research fellow in Jewish studies this year, and some of you may have been and heard him speak on our last in-person event last semester on the 4th of December on Hispanic notes on Hispanic anti-Semitism. The way it will work today, I see there's so many of you here, is that we, unlike in our traditional webinars, we actually enabled chat, so you can respond, you can chat with each other, and also you can tell us where you are joining us from. I know we have a very international audience, so it is a little bit more interactive than our regular webinar. So then first Ilan will speak, and then after that I will rejoin and will moderate the Q&A. So welcome everybody. Ilan, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Magda. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you to Fordham University for its openness and preparation and offering of courses like this, especially in this cold winter season and in this doomy political and cultural landscape. I am thrilled to be here with all of you and engage us all in conversation in the pursuit of knowledge and in the hope that we are going to open up a series of new vistas on what is Jewish theology in Latin America. I have divided these three sessions into periods and into individuals. There are many ways to approach this topic, and all of those ways are defined not only by the richness and diversity of the material, but as is always the case in knowledge, by the eye of the beholder, in this case, me. I have chosen individuals in three crucial periods in the history of Latin America to enable us to understand both what they were thinking in relation to God, what the period that surrounded them or in which they were embedded was all about. And the hope is that those individuals will allow us to appreciate a larger conversation, chronological in time, but also longitudinal in its nature, of an ongoing topic that has been central to the Jewish experience in Latin America. The first session, the one today, is devoted exclusively to the Conversos, and that is in the colonial period. The second session moves fast to the 20th century and focuses on one author, Jorge Luis Borges, and explores the dilemmas of Jewish life and the connections with God, especially in the middle of the 20th century. And then the last session moves to the end of the 20th century and even beyond, and it explores ethical Jewish questions connected with God through the perspective of an American rabbi who was instrumental in building the most important rabbinical school in Latin America that is located in Buenos Aires, and also the story of a man who survived the Second World War. This is the second figure of the last session, was a teacher of Elie Wiesel and Emmanuel Levinas, and eventually, toward the end of his life, he moved to Montevideo, just neighboring Argentina, and died there. And we will reflect, or I will reflect, on Monsieur Chouchani, an emblematic figure that I think will help us wrap up some of the arguments that I'm hoping to be making. A few caveats or a few general concepts that I think are important to keep in mind. The word Latin America, or the name Latin America, is a rather recent one. There was no Latin America during the colonial period. There was no Latin America in the 17th century. Latin America is a name among many names that have been used mostly by Europeans and Americans to describe the region that today goes from the embattled US-Mexican border to the Patagonia in Tierra de Fuego at the very bottom in the southern part of the Americas. It was the byproduct, this concept of Latin America, of a number of Chilean intellectuals in the second half of the 19th century, living mostly in Paris and figuring out at a time of incessant independent movements how to call collectively all these many nations, eventually 22, that were acquiring their own autonomy, sovereignty, and their own place in the conversation of contemporary countries. And they settled on the concept of Latin, not because Latin was spoken in Latin America, although the languages that are the predominant languages there now are all part of the Romance family, the Romance language family, and so they are sourced from Latin, but because, according to these Chileans, what unified these many nations was the Roman law that they wanted to use in shaping their legal and judicial systems. And so they settled for Latin America, though from the very beginning there were dissenters, and people call this two Americas. I'm not talking about the United States and Canada, the Hispano-America and the Luso-America, the Hispano that connects to Spain and the Luso that connects with Portugal. So it's important to keep in mind that when I talk about Latin America today, the people that we're going to be talking about are really absolutely unaware and would be an anachronism in that in being seen through that prism. At the time of their lives, both Luis de Carvajal the Younger, the first protagonist of the session today, a Spaniard that as a young man had moved from central Spain to northern Mexico, following his uncle, with the belief that the life of those that were secret Jews that had openly and publicly converted to Catholicism, but that privately and domestically kept their Jewish identity intact, would have a better life on the other side of the Atlantic. He is one. And the other one is a nun, also from Mexico, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, arguably the most important poet of Latin America in a contested topic, contested name in that period, and arguably the best poet that Latin America has ever had. She herself was not a crypto-Jew, but was the daughter of a new Christian family. And she lived in a convent. I will say more about her in a second, and explored the life of a woman and of somebody who felt persecuted by her environment in dramatic and agonizing ways as such. So here I am inviting also to offer context to a second concept, and that is the term converso. Converso is somebody who has already converted to Catholicism, Christianity, but who is identified by the environment as either themselves or their families having done this religious transition. And so at the time in Spain, and as a result in Latin America, the Conversos are seen as newcomers, as arrivists, as imposters, as people who probably were hoping to be embraced by Catholicism, but the environment still sees them as outsiders, as foreign, as not quite part of the old Catholic tradition, the Hispanic tradition of hidalgos and knights and so on. Crypto Jew is somebody who is openly keeping the religion of Judaism, even though their families might have converted to Christianity, Catholicism in particular. And there is a term of new Christian. Those like Conversos are categorized by being new vis-a-vis the old Christians who can prove with their own ancestry that at least for 3 generations, they come from families of a heritage Catholics. Finally, the term that I want to make sure that will be my buffer, my rail throughout these 3 lectures is theology. Theology can be understood in a number of different ways. I will explore it as an exploration or study of religious faith and practice and experience, mostly as a dialogue with God. As a result, theology can be produced by theologians, that is, professionals that devote themselves to that dialogue, to that study, to historicizing the practice and experience of finding the divine. But as it is always the case in Latin America, we are improvising texts continuously, improvising ourselves, and there's always a tension between how we present our ideas to the environment, our immediate environment, and how we present it to the old European tradition. And one of the things that you're going to see throughout my 3 lectures is that really none of the half a dozen thinkers, poets, rabbis, Talmudists, essayists, short story writers defines themselves as a theologian, but they are constantly obsessed and engaged with theology. So one of the beauties of all this is that the texts that they produce are exactly what they feel would be the best forum for their dialogue with God or exploration of their faith. And they can be poems, they can be letters, they can be sermons, they can be short stories, they can be lectures, all of which we're going to be seeing throughout these 3 sessions. The first character that I want to focus my attention on is Luis de Carvajal the Younger, an absolutely enthralling figure that lived in Mexico in it's really the second part of the 16th century. He was born in Spain in 1566, as I mentioned, in Middle Spain, where most of the soldiers and missionaries and conquerors came to the Americas in the aftermath of the so-called discovery in 1492, and settled the region. He lived in what is today New Spain and eventually would become Mexico. Luis de Carvajal the Younger came following his uncle, who was the governor of the state of Nuevo León, a northern state in Mexico, still very powerful today. Luis de Carvajal the Older was himself a man who had his hidden Jewish identity as a crypto-Jew well established, and yet, because of a variety of reasons, managed to get indulgence from clerics and high-end religious figures in the Catholic Church, and became the governor of a state that was known for its agitated, unhappy indigenous population. Luis de Carvajal the Older, the uncle, thus is frequently referred as the pacifier of the Indians. He brought his sister and his nephews and nieces and other family members to New Spain, to Nuevo León, with the conviction that it was there that they were going to be able to practice quietly, hiddenly, their Jewish religion in a way they were not able to do in Spain. And so it's important to keep in mind that their arrival means that they are hidden Jews, that they are secret, that they are part of a small community that looks for God, the Jewish God, in a way that is tight and in the shadows, away from the public mainstream light, and as a result has to look for strategies to pass on information to one another that is often dangerous and that can put them in jeopardy. Luis de Carvajal the Younger is known for many things, but arguably the most important one is that he is the author of the very first autobiography by a Jew ever written in the New World. And this is the document that I gave everybody to read, the autobiography of Luis de Carvajal the Younger, who describes himself in the text in the third person as Joseph Lumbroso, Jose Lumbroso. And this is perhaps the very first fascinating aspect that I want to call your attention to, The fact that when writing his autobiography, he is confessional, he is ready to narrate his qualms with finding his Judaism. The question is, who is he writing this text for? Knowing that any text of this nature could ultimately get him in trouble with the inquisitors and lead him to torture, prison, and in the end to being burned at the stake in an auto de fe. I can advance but you already know it, that from the introduction by Martin Cohen, the translator into English of this text, that all of those things eventually happened. Luis de Carvajal the Younger, having written this text, was captured by the Inquisition, imprisoned in the Palacio de la Inquisición, which is right in downtown Mexico City, almost across the street from where the current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, herself a Jew of Sephardic and Ashkenazi descent, legislates in the Palacio Nacional. In that Palacio de la Inquisición, the Palace of the Inquisition, Luis de Carvajal, his mother, his sister, other relatives, and many other crypto-Jews, but also other types of heretics, rebels, deviants, and folks that the Spanish Inquisition judged rebellious and dangerous, were isolated, were imprisoned, were frequently tortured. And Luis de Carvajal, his mother and his sister, are indeed the most famous victims ever to be burned at the stake by the Inquisition in the capital of New Spain, Mexico City today. And it is right, not far, that plaza, the Plaza de la Inquisición, la Plaza del Quemadero, not far from the palace. And so the question is, why did he, Luis de Carvajal, end up confessing all this in a document that he wrote for himself without being asked by the Inquisition to write? He left two other major documents. One is a series of letters that he sent back and forth to his mother and his sister while they were in the prison. And the third one is a last will and a testament where he, in one last breath, explains his life. It's a very short document and tells about his journey. The essential aspect of the document that you have with you, the autobiography, is that Luis de Carvajal realizes, and I should say here that some have studied him from a psychiatric perspective, and he might have been bipolar or schizophrenic or suffering from different types of delusions, that this is a man who, having arrived to a better place thanks to his uncle, gets convinced that he himself is kind of biblical prophet who is bestowed with the responsibility to connect with the Jewish God, the God of the Bible, the God of the prophets, particularly the God of David, the God of Ezra, and the God of the Psalms, and sees upon himself the responsibility of leading other crypto-Jews that are living in New Spain at that time out of the bondage of their secrecy and of their silence and of their shame, having converted from Judaism to Catholicism, into a new tribe, that is the tribe of the enlightened, the Iluminados. He saw himself as an Illuminati, even before the term, or unlike the term, had been used in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, and used a rhetoric to communicate with God so that his document would be able to reach, and here is the answer to the question that I asked before, it would reach other initiated crypto-Jews in this quest to return to the old faith. He had not been raised with a Jewish education, though he knew some Hebrew. Most of the readings that he had done of the Bible were of the Christian Bible, and also they were either in Spanish or in Latin. At various parts of the autobiography, he reflects on connections that he feels with Ezra, with David, with the Psalms, and is convinced that even without his knowledge of the real sources, that he has to devote himself fully to God and be connected with God, because God has written his life, has created a kind of meta narrative that is a kind of fate, F-A-T-E, that will lead him and those that he is able to persuade and embrace his vision out of bondage. His quest, as a result, his theological quest, is a quest about coming out, making public what is private, in spite of the dangers that that represents. And he does so in the third person. It's fascinating to read an autobiography where the autobiographer is not writing in the first person. I was born in such a date. I circumcised myself in the river Pánuco when I realized that I had to reconnect with God. But instead, he switches to the third person to gain a distance or an objectivity that will allow him to see himself perhaps more objectively, but see himself more than anything else as a character, as a biblical character, a descendant of those that he admires so much, and that is the past that appears in the Bible. One of another fascinating aspect of the autobiography is that he is convinced that God is in dialogue with him as much as he is in dialogue with God. He searches for God, he looks rhetorically for answers to his questions, but constantly is convinced, and that is a very common vision of the mystic, that God is sending messages by making him have the opportunity to read a book that is otherwise prohibited, or by sending him an individual like the person that he is going to have with him as a co-cellmate with whom he can discuss aspects of the Bible and of his own mission. This mutual dialogue, man in search of God, as much as it is God in search of man, is very much the legacy of Joseph Lombroso, aka Luis de Carvajal the Younger. For many years, let me conclude this part because I'm going to move to Sor Juana. For many years, the autobiography, which the inquisitors had finally found and used in order to prove that he was a Judaizer, un judaizante, Luis de Carvajal, kept it in an archive when Mexico became an independent nation in 1910. Eventually, it was moved to the building El Archivo Nacional, the National Archives, from where it was stolen. This extraordinary document written in a minuscule, finely shaped handwriting in a book not bigger than this size by a Brazilian Jewish scholar that was in the middle of a feud with another Mexican scholar, and perhaps out of vengeance, it put this little booklet by Luis de Carvajal in his pocket, left the Archivo Nacional, and that document disappeared. We hunted for that document for years, 60, 70 years, it was lost. And finally, at the very end of the last decade, it reemerged. The FBI was involved. I was asked by the FBI and by a philanthropist who was involved and intent on recovering this document to legitimize it, to authenticate it. It was acquired by this philanthropist, exhibited at the New York Historical Society, and then eventually repatriated to Mexico, to the Jewish community, where it is now housed in a museum that both that Jewish community and the entire nation can consult. It's a happy story about a very happy theological investigation. The very first crypto-Jew who comes out to describe himself as a biblical prophet and pays the price of dying at the stake in an auto de fe that, among others, Diego Rivera, who himself thought that he was a descendant of crypto-Jews, depicted in a mural, very famous mural, where Luis de Carvajal is dressed with a San Benito, the uniform that the inquisitors gave to those that they imprisoned to shame them as they walked them from one part of downtown to another. We might return to the autobiography of Luis de Carvajal in the Q&A, and this is a good opportunity to also mention that you are invited to write to me at any point about him or Sor Juana or any of the topics by email. My email is istavans@amherst.edu. I get a substantial amount of correspondence, but I try to go through it consistently, and you will get a response one way or another. I am switching from the 16th century. The auto de fe happened in 1596 to the end of the following century, the 17th century, with the magnificent author Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Her dates are 1648, 1695. In other words, she dies almost exactly 100 years after Luis de Carvajal, for many reasons, especially the control that the church had. She knows nothing about Luis de Carvajal. Many of the new Christians and Conversos will know nothing about the crypto-Jews up until the 20th century, when some of their material, letters and the autobiography and recipes and other such items will start to emerge. My admiration for Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz almost has no limits. She is a poet and a writer of extraordinary caliber, and a woman of intellect who is described, and rightly so, as a proto-feminist. Among the very first women to fight for the rights of other women, and not only in regular life, but especially inside the convent and the monastery, and in the pursuit of knowledge. Sor Juana was an illegitimate child. She was born out of wedlock. Her maternal side was a family known for having been new Christians and even conversos. There is one particular family member that seemed to constantly be pursued by the Inquisition, first in Spain and then in Latin America, because of his activities in the act and art of Judaizing. The fact that she was an illegitimate child and a girl already put her at a disadvantage in colonial Mexico. That meant that being out of wedlock, you would have trouble finding a husband, you would have trouble getting enrolled in schools, and you would be frowned upon because of your background. Sor Juana was raised by her mother with her sister and some of her brothers. She, from a very early age, was a passionate reader. And one of the most astonishing documents that she left is also an autobiography. It is a letter that she wrote to her confessor. When the confessor, when she was already a nun, told her that she was too vocal about being a woman, that her poems were too good, and that she needed to be quiet. She needed to respect the patriarchy of the church, and that the bishop of Mexico City, wanted her to renounce the writing of poetry. Instead, and eventually she did this, but instead of falling into silence right away, she chose to write a manifesto, a j'accuse, a confrontational letter to her confessor that fascinatingly is called Letter to Fray Dorotea de la Cruz, that pretends that the confessor is also a woman. And in it, Sor Juana describes the plight of having come out of wedlock, having fallen in love with knowledge, having discovered that books are the only way to explore the roundness and the completeness of the world, and denouncing the men of the church for silencing the voice of women and not enabling them to advance. She had her choices were very limited, and Sor Juana at one point served in the court of the wife of the archbishop, with whom she is likely to have had a lesbian relationship. She leaves at an early age the court because of some scandal about which we know very little, and she enters the convent with the help of some of her family members who collect money in order to create a room in one of the Carmelite convents where she will be able to read and write, because in the court already she was known as a poet and she wants to continue being a poet. In the convent, she rises high in the institutional hierarchy, and she is known for writing villancicos, coplas, and all kinds of folkloric songs about the native population, about the Aztecs, and especially in Nahuatl. She is fascinated in mestizaje, in the mixing of Spanish and Aztec cultures, and she is one of the first ones who writes about the encounter of the two sides. How aware is Sor Juana of her own new Christian and of her Converso ancestry has been a subject of much debate. Many of her masterpieces are in the form of poetry. One of the most famous poems that she writes is called First Dream, Primero Sueño, or also called, in translation, First I Dream. It is an epistemological poem of just stunning reach, in which, and this is a favorite aspect of Sor Juana, the soul, a body unnamed, falls asleep. That's the very beginning of the poem. Detente sombra de mi bien esquivo is something that she will carry on later on in another poem. The soul separates from the body, and during the span of the night and of dreams, the soul travels the universe and explores minerals and fauna and geography, and is anxious to reach God and ask God to explain how is it that things relate to one another. At the very center of it is not Christ himself, but it's a fatherly figure that is the orchestrator of the world as a whole. And Sor Juana, in this mystical but epistemological also poem, offers a vision of what a woman of incredible wisdom and erudition, who knows the Greek and Latin theologians and philosophers, starting with Aristotle and Plato to Occam and many others in the Middle Ages, it shapes her theology in the form of an exquisitely complex, the term really is Baroque poem, that will show the quest of the human mind to understand the universe. Is this the byproduct of a poet that is also a woman that has all this knowledge, and that enough gives us a profile of Sor Juana? Or, as I am suggesting here, this has yet another layer. This is a poem of somebody who very much understands herself as being unique because of her Converso background. Conversos in Mexico at that time were known for cosmopolitan knowledge, for sometimes not using Christ as their main addressee in their poetry or in their writing, but going to the fatherly God as their main figure, and exploring the world not confined only by what Mexico is, but using the soul to see the world entire. Now, I gave you a series of other poems by Sor Juana, but I want to mention two in particular here that I think, in fact, I want to read one of them. In the poems that I gave you, they are all sonnets. She writes about being persecuted and about suffering the fate of those that are not welcomed, that are outsiders, that are pushed aside because of their intellectual ambition. This is a quality that Conversos and New Christians had, and they were often penalized for them. I will be referring in my last 5 minutes before we go to the Q&A to two of the poems. The first one is the sonnet 146, which is on page 170 and 171. This is a translation by Margaret Sayers-Peden, an extraordinary translator from Spanish into English. It's incredibly difficult to translate a sonnet from Spanish into English because of the difference of pentameters. This is her English version, and then I'll read the Spanish version. In my pursuit world, why such diligence? What my offense when I am those inclined, ensuring elegance affect my mind, not that my mind affect an elegance. I have no love of riches or finance, and thus do I most happily, I find, expend finances to enrich my mind, and not mind expend upon finance. I worship beauty not, but vilify that spoils of time that mocks eternity, nor less deceitful treasures glorify, but hold foremost with greatest constancy, consuming all the vanity in life, and not consuming life in vanity. Here, the original. En perseguirme mundo, ¿qué interesas? ¿En qué te ofendo cuando solo intento poner belleza en mi entendimiento y no mi entendimiento en las bellezas? Yo no estimo tesoros ni riquezas, y así siempre me causa más contento poner riquezas en mi pensamiento que no mi pensamiento en las riquezas. Y no estimo hermosura que vencida es despojo civil de las edades, ni riqueza me agrada fementida, teniendo por mejor en mis verdades consumir vanidades de la vida que consumir la vida en vanidades. Particularly the first line, en perseguirme mundo, ¿qué interesas? In pursuing me, Margaret Sayer-Speden has a different translation. In pursuing me, world, what is your intention? What is your purpose? This is a poem by a woman who is rejecting her own physical beauty in favor of intellectual life. This is also a poem by a poet who sees herself as persecuted because of her ancestry, because of her illegitimate birth, as an outcast who finds in poetry the way out to explore her condition as a pariah. And that condition is very much what the Conversos in Mexico will be discussing all the time. And then the other poem that I want to bring here, it's an extraordinary poem. It's the one on, is the Sonnet 165, and it's about a shadow that appears to her at night. Again, I will read first the Spanish and then go to the English. This is by Margaret Sayer-Speden. Stay, shadow of contentment too short-lived, illusion of enchantment I most praise, fair image of whom happily I die, sweet fiction for whom painfully I live. If answering your charms imperative, complaint I like steel to magnet fly, by what logic do you flatter and entice, only to flee a taunting fugitive? There's no triumph that you so smugly boast, that I fell victim to your tyranny, though from encircling bonds that held you fast, your elusive form too readily slip free, and through to my arms you are forever lost. You are a prisoner of my fantasy. Spanish, one of the best sonnets of the Spanish language. Detente sombra de mi bien esquivo, imagen del hechizo que más quiero, bella ilusión por quien alegre muero, dulce ficción por quien penosa vivo. Si al imán de tus gracias atractivo, sirve mi pecho de obediente acero, ¿para qué me enamoras lisonjero si has de burlarme luego fugitivo? Mas blasonar no puedes, satisfecho, de que triunfa de mí tu tiranía, que aunque dejas burlado el lazo estrecho que tu forma fantástica ceñía, poco importa burlar brazos y pecho, Si te labra prisión mi fantasía. This is a story, this is a poem about a shadow, a sombra, that shows up at night in her cell in the convent where she lived in Mexico City, the Carmelite convent, where she writes to be the treasurer and from where her poetry was disseminated throughout Mexico, Peru, other parts of Latin America. And she was one of the very first poets to be read in Spain, where she talks that she is visited by a suspicious, strange, a fleeing a shadow that talks to her, enraptures her, makes her maybe sexualized, full of desire, and then disappears. Could this be an image of a poet who is a proto-feminist, but is also engaging in lesbian relationships, especially with the wife of the Archviceroy of Mexico, with whom she had a very close friendship, for whom she had to run away from the court, and who frequently visited her during the day in that convent? Or is this also a figurative image of another force that is arriving and that controls her? Very often the Conversos use a rhetoric that brings forth images of outside forces that control them, that want to imprison them, and from which they have to escape. Sor Juana articulates all this in an extraordinary fashion here. Arguably, the most interesting part of this sonnet is that in the end, she says, who is a prisoner of whom in this sonnet? Am I a prisoner of you who surreptitiously visit me at night, and I am at your mercy, always ready to do with you as you wish? Or are you my prisoner because it is in my fantasy that you live? And even if you perceive freedom once you leave this cell, this chamber where we both meet, you are always in my imagination. I can't think of a more potent way for a new Christian who comes from a Converso family to explore the idea of how her mind is at the mercy of others, controlled, but also controlling the world of these shadows by manipulating those shadows and giving them shelter. Who is more a prisoner, the captor or the captive? Who controls the imagination of the other one? Now, to conclude this part of Sor Juana, let me emphasize the fact that in all of these poems, and this has been said many times, a nun doesn't write about God. She writes about herself, these shadows, how the world is against her, how she needs to find a place for herself, and how as a woman she disdains beauty, she wants intellect, but the world is not ready to allow her intellect, again, as a woman, but also as a descendant of a long Jewish tradition, to flourish. As in the case of Carvajal, Sor Juana's ending is tragic. The patriarchy in the church, in the convent first, and then in the Mexican church, ultimately forced her to silence. She is asked to sell all her books and never to write another poem. So she falls into that quietness at the very end of her life. And that quietness serves as a counterpoint to the very strident, very influential voice that she will have when she writes and in posterity. And she also becomes much more engaged in the affairs of the convent. There is a plague, a dark plague that sweeps Mexico, the indigenous population especially, but also the population in convents and monasteries. And she dies and is buried in an unidentified cell until many, many years later in the 20th century, where her remains are recovered and she becomes an icon of contemporary Mexico. I will conclude here. Give me a oh my God, did I disappear?
No, you did not. You are
Oh,
here.
I'm right here.
You
So
are.
okay, I see it here. So Magda, let me go back to you. Let me just, before I do that, remind everybody that what we have for next week is a series of stories by the Argentine writer who was not Jewish, but was a Judophile, Jorge Luis Borges. You will read 3 stories by him and also a lecture that he offered in Argentina in 1952 called The Argentine Writer and Tradition, where he explores the role of Jews in Argentina and in the world entire. So let me now bring it back to you, Magda.
Yes, I invite all of you to submit questions or comments in the chat or in the Q&A, wherever you want. Chat is obviously accessible to everybody. I see there's already one question. I have a couple of questions for you as I was listening to you. One is related to the question that has been asked about how much the works or the writings by Carvajal or Sor Juana, whether they were known to others in their lifetimes. And I would like to expand on that to ask how they were preserved, these texts, disseminated, and in whichever period, and then and disseminated, preserved and disseminated.
Wonderful question. The works of Luis de Carvajal were not known until the 20th century. They were mostly archived in the Archivo Nacional, that was the inheritor of the inquisitorial archives that were built during the colonial period. And it wasn't until a series of artists, intellectuals, and historians at the very end of the 19th century, but especially in the first half of the 20th century, attempting to recover the voices of some of the early Jewish immigrants to Mexico, that they started to receive the attention that ultimately led to an explosion of interest that they have been receiving at the end of the 20th century and the 21st century. I should add that even though Luis de Carvajal is well known in intellectual and scholarly circles, to historians and to theologians, to scholars of the Inquisition and of Conversos and crypto-Judaism, in Mexican culture in general, Luis de Carvajal the Younger is absolutely unknown. He's not read in high schools. He is not part of any curriculum. The story of the crypto-Jews and the Conversos remains a quiet, silenced, censored topic in contemporary Mexico. There is much more about subsequent Jewish immigrations than about colonial period crypto-Jewish immigrations. So it's mainly historians that know him. There is, for instance, no available edition of the autobiography that circulates widely in Mexico, or of the letters or the Last Will and Testament. There has been a movie on him, El Santo Oficio. There have been all kinds of studies on him, but again, the reach is either more limited, or in the case of that movie, it can sensationalize the persecution and ultimately the auto de fe. The case of Sor Juana is totally different. Sor Juana is broadly, widely, and profusely known. She is an icon of Mexican culture. There are 3 women in Mexico that serve as myths in the shaping of the nation. One is the Virgin of Guadalupe, the kind of Mexican version of the Virgin Mary. The second one is Frida Kahlo, an immigrant, the daughter of a German immigrant who is very well known for her paintings. And the third one is Sor Juana. She is in currencies, in stamps, in all kinds of other items. Her poetry is memorized in middle schools and high schools. There are endless studies of her. There are biographies by Octavio Paz, Nobel Prize winner, and others. However, the Converso side, New Christian side of Sor Juana, is far less studied. Mexico has not been fully ready to enter into the exploration of the Jewish ancestry of Sor Juana and of other canonical figures, because it is a very Catholic nation, and because it, in spite of the current president and of the current more cosmopolitan open landscape, it still sees Jews as suspicious figures.
And even more suspicious if they were secretly
Right.
sorry. So when you were talking about Luis de Carvajal and his autobiography, you said that he wrote it for himself. And you also noted, and many scholars have studied, the sort of autobiographies that were commissioned by the Inquisition. And I wonder whether, if we took it to your larger question about what is Jewish theology in this region, what kind of theology emerges from these other ego documents, autobiographies from the Inquisition, and how then Carvajal's theology may compare to those other texts and other theologies that emerge?
Beautiful question again. There is a plethora of documents that are ego documents, as you call them, or autobiographical documents, memoirs, that are almost exclusively forced by the inquisitors on the victim as a confession of their plight. And the vast majority of them are letters or confessionals where they acknowledge that they have gone on the wrong path, the false direction, that they were Judaizing, that they were not fully convinced of their Catholicism, of their vision of the Catholic God as the right one. But the documents that we have, again, almost exclusively recant that Judaizing approach and embrace the rhetoric that the inquisitors want. Yes, I sinned. Now I repent. Christ is the right approach, is my God, and I now, from here on, devote myself exclusively to him. And the documents that we have, both in Mexico and in Peru, which were the two centers of the Inquisition, are to a large extent this type of repetitive approach of, I have finally seen the light of Catholicism, and I am writing this document to prove it. The case of Carvajal is exactly the opposite. He doesn't write this for the Inquisition. He writes it for himself. He knows this can be used by the Inquisition against him, and indeed it is. And that's why the document becomes so important, and Luis de Carvajal becomes a martyr and a victim. And he does not talk about Christ in the document. He does not talk about the Catholic God. He talks exclusively about the dialogue that he maintains with the biblical God of the Hebrew Bible, and how he is now a biblical prophet the way the biblical prophets were before. In that sense, it's absolutely sui generis. We don't have anything similar in Latin America, we're talking in that period, especially in Mexico, compared to the autobiography.
Mm-hmm. So there is a question from our colleague and also past fellow, Marion Miller, about the notion of Judaizing. So if you could address the notion of Judaizing as the sin under which the Inquisition and the expulsion played out, but whose meaning is problematic. Jews are not a people given to evangelizing. So very likely we're not trying to convert people who are always Christians. Is it possible that to Judaize people who are crypto-Jews or identify themselves as Jews? So the question is, who were the Judaizers? And
Yeah, perfect. Wonderful, wonderful question. Let me start with a semantic reference here. The word Judaizar, Judaize, is still in the Spanish dictionary. In the Royal Academy of the Spanish Language Dictionary, the word Judaizar is taken to mean an individual who either overtly or quietly spreads the faith of Moses and the Bible among those that are not directly from that faith. It's itself a fascinating definition. Who is the proselytizer here and who is the audience of the proselytizer? But as a native Spanish language speaker, I and many others, Jews and non-Jews, feel shame by the fact that the word itself remains a term that is not only in historical dictionaries, but in other types of dictionaries that are used frequently today. And I say this because the term Judaizar is often invoked as in moments of rebellion in Latin America for those who are seeking to undermine the status quo. When the Spanish monarchy and in the Spanish-speaking Americas tried to delegitimize the independence-seeking rebels at the beginning of the 19th century, who were looking to create autonomous nations like Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Mexico, Cuba, they immediately described them as Judaizantes, individuals that wanted to use the wrong ideology to undermine the established mainstream ideology. It didn't necessarily mean that they were spreading Judaism. Judaizar is taken metaphorically as a term to bring in an ideology that is subversive and wants to undermine the status quo. One of the most important figures of the Mexican Revolution, Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, himself a priest, was constantly referred to by the monarchy and by the Catholic Church as a Judaizante because he wanted Mexico to become independent. So the term Judaizante, Judaizar, arrives with the Spanish language to the Americas. I should stress at this point that the Americas speak today two languages that, though we are the largest population of speakers, Spanish and Portuguese, are really European languages that we have turned into our own languages, the varieties of our languages. And we, for that reason, often think of ourselves as living in translation or living and experiencing life through somebody else's language, the language that came from abroad. That adds to the sense of impostorship or outsiderness or never feeling quite as a local individual. The term judaizar was used in the time of Luis de Carvajal and of Sor Juana to attack those that were seen as not belonging to the society fully and authentically, to question their place in that society, even if the information about their families was often not fully available. Eres un judaizante meant you're bringing here elements of a faith that is trying to undermine how we built the Catholic view of the world right here. So when Sor Juana is described as a judaizante, or when Carvajal is described as a judaizante, it might mean that the accuser is referring to them as descendants of Jews, but it might simply mean that they are being referred as dangerous rebels that are not fitting into the parameters of the status quo.
Yeah, and I might just add that in the pre-modern period, that certainly is used. Yeah, if they are crypto Jews, they are technically Christians. So to try to bring them into the fold is seen as proselytizing Christians, right? So that's part of the and falls in very strict canon law procedures of proselytizing and causing heresy. Yeah.
In the case of Carvajal, there is no doubt that he's a proselytizer. When he becomes convinced that he's a biblical prophet, his job is to persuade other conversos and crypto Jews that they should come back to the Jewish faith. And he goes out with this document, and in sessions that he has, he accounts for those sessions in his letters about convincing them that now in this new land, they can be the authentic self that has been pushed down and censored before.
Mm-hmm. So I have two small questions about Carvajal, and then about Sor Juana. So one is very quick one, whether there is a modern Spanish version of his autobiography available.
I'm afraid not.
Okay.
And that is a dream. There are two dreams that I have. One is that the autobiography will be available in English in a new translation, annotated, because the translation that I gave you is from the 1950s or 1960s. And there's much more knowledge that we have accumulated about Carvajal recently, but that Mexico changes and that there's an openness to have an edition that is not only for scholars, but an edition that can circulate in the open market about Luis de Carvajal in his own voice, and maybe with addendums of various people that have written about him over time.
And then one more about the Carvajal, and then I'll turn to Sor Juana. So there is a question whether there's any truth to the story about that he supposedly relayed about a spy priest in his cell who befriended and deceived him and extracted additional information on him and other conversos who were later also executed.
Most of what we know about Carvajal comes from him directly, or from the confessionals of his sister and his mother, and maybe one or two others, like the Dominican and the Franciscan, that are, although the documents are corrupt, incomplete, and It's a hearsay story, as it often happens with ego documents, with memoirs. There has been a biography of Carvajal called The Martyr, also by the same translator, Martin Cohen, that I recommend highly. But most of the knowledge that we have comes from him directly.
So I will close. There, by the way, you should, all of you should follow the chat because there are some really great recommendations of books and films and so. So two questions about Sor Juana. One is whether she regarded herself as Catholic. And I would maybe make that even more specific because obviously they were all Catholic, but whether she saw herself as part of her Converso sort of crypto-Jewish heritage or really embraced Catholicism in that way. And the other question about her was whether sorry, what was that? Oh no, I have already asked that. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. There were, as I mentioned, only three options for women in colonial Mexico in the 17th century. One was marriage, the second one was the court, and the third one was the convent. Prostitution was the fourth, but I'm limiting myself to these other three. Sor Juana doesn't come from a religious family. She doesn't write about being religious when she was a little girl. She writes in that letter that I mentioned to her confessor about her deep and uncontrollable desire to write poetry and to learn more about how the human mind works. She enters the court first, where she works, and she allows herself to create this space within the court where she can write poems. She becomes very well known for those poems. She might have had a lesbian relationship with the wife of the leader of Mexico or at that time. And then she has to run away from that. The two other options would have been marriage. She doesn't want to be anybody's wife. She doesn't want to be serving a man. And so the convent becomes the only option. Does Sor Juana, and this is an ongoing question in history, does Sor Juana enter the convent because she is a devout nun, passionate about her connection, commitment, dialogue with Christ? Or does she go there pretending that she has a dialogue with Christ, that she will be a nun like everybody else, but it's because she wants to find a space where she can write her poetry? Most likely, many of us today fall into the last category. She is pretending to be a nun. She follows the life of the nuns. She becomes the treasurer of her convent. She's beloved as a nun. But what she does most of the time is read, and very often, secular books, though she is also following very closely theological debates that are taking place in Portugal, in Spain, and throughout Latin America. And one of them she gets involved in and gets in trouble, a famous debate with El Padre Vieira, Father Vieira. So did she see herself as Catholic? Well, everybody was Catholic at that time. So the answer is yes. Was she a devout nun? Did she see herself in that dialogue? Could we say that that shadow in that sonnet is Christ that is appearing in her cell, and that she, as other nuns, is having a physical, mystical, theological encounter with Christ? I think, as in all good poetry, that is open to interpretation.
Well, and on that note, I want to thank you for a fascinating lecture, and to all of you for coming and for great questions and comments. And yes, I will try to collect some of those suggestions and send us it in a follow-up email so everybody has access to that. So again, I'm looking forward to more next week, next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. And thank you, Ilan, and thank you everybody for
Maybe
joining us.
just before you go,
Yeah.
if the wonderful readers and participants that we have time, there's one more story by Borges that I did not put, but that if you find on your own, you will fully enjoy. I will mention it in passing, though it will not be the centerpiece of my discussion. It's called Emazunz, Emazunz. It's a short story and it's widely available online. Be well. Happy new Goyish year.
Yes,
And,
Happy New Year. And we'll see you
and
next
thank
year.
you.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.